Commissioner Trumbull here.
Schwartz present.
Commissioner Forcell, present.
Danaher present.
Johnston present.
All right, that'll be it for this evening. We've got one speaker that's an item not on the agenda, so we'll start with that. Bob Evans, do you want to address it?
Sure. I'd like to just basically bring some things to your attention. And perhaps through this you can maybe learn how to be a little more inquisitive into the fiber goings on in the town. I'm the founder of Fiber Internet Center in 2001. I've been a city fiber user since before that. After working with the city for well over a decade, since the days of John Ulrich and Blake Heineman, I believe it was, I've been perplexed by the way the city prices fiber. I was told in 2001 to build a ring. Was it working? Okay, thank you. I was told in 2001 to build a ring and I would receive discounts where drops from my leased fiber in the street to a building would be a flat $150. When we grew large enough and absorbed the costs for the miles required that qualified, the city changed the billing completely to one where there was a minimum project fee required every month, $650 per building to add to my ring. Over time, I mentioned it to the fiber staff and they blamed the people who sat in the chairs before you. Years later, I realized staff largely recommended project costs and minimum pricing plan changes. Why doesn't the city have customers like myself involved in annual pricing process? FIC pays over $200,000 a year for city fiber leases. Are any of you aware of the costs that the competitors go down year after year? Yours go up. As a result of the complexity and confusion and changing price schemes, Fiber Internet Center in Palo Alto alone, we have more customers connected with our AT&T leased fiber than we do with the cities, and we began with the city's fiber. Oddly, the city over the years has considered us a competitor. We put in 144 strands in our California Avenue facility, set up server co-location services, only to see the city promote PACs over us as a place to terminate fiber and reach the internet. At 2635 Park Boulevard, we carry customers beyond PACs to ISPs, networked and data centers from Los Angeles to Seattle. Yet the city promotes PACs as the place to terminate. Years ago, the city promoted a link on the city's website for an internet competitor, Hurricane Electric, which is located in Fremont, California, to all of the city's customers that ordered fiber and directly encouraged everyone to order a connection to them at PACs because they're the low price leader. I brought this to people's attention several times and also asked for a link. Instead, I was told that the city's not allowed to promote anybody, and so instead of adding others that you could connect to, the city removed Hurricane Electric's link and just promoted PACs owned by Equinix, a large public company. I'm an LLC down the street, and I started with your fiber first. Why does it take so long to get fiber in a building? My experience tells me there's been more time and paperwork than actual installation. We have competitors calling us and asking us to get them city fiber. You gotta wonder why. Why are there fees associated with the installation? I have paid over the years for some things, here's one of them, $8,000 to install fiber that took 2 to 3 hours and about $500 worth of fiber cable. The last fiber drop we bought just recently, it was installed this week. We discovered we only had a 1-year commitment. We're accustomed to seeing 5-year commitments to get the lowest monthly fee. Why is there no marketing to us about these pricing changes and commit changes? How does this affect our existing mileage drops that we have in our multi-year contractual commitments Who's responsible for this communications to us? With all the parking and other commits of a newly constructed building, in order to get it put in place and go through, why not make sure a building has a $50 pipe installed to the sidewalk to pull in city fiber someday? I recall when Fiber Internet Center made the front page of the local newspaper with a headline that we pulled the plug from Palo Alto. We did. We closed our co-location services at California Avenue due to poor power, AC power, and the city's favoritism to PACs. Our colo is now in Mountain View. I have not heard anything about the city fixing its primary or secondary AC power paths, such that they do not share the same physical poles and pathways. Remember the Palo Alto airport accident that took down both at the same time? Have we fixed this? We told the public there would be diversity, and I don't know if there is any, and when I ask, nobody knows. I look forward to hearing back from the UAC on these items that I've mentioned tonight, if you so choose to. And I've documented what I've said here for you. This is the tip of my iceberg after starting Fiber Internet Center in 2001. So if it sounds like something like, gee, what's going on here, Bob? It's like, well, I pay a lot of money for fiber. I do want my services. I want you guys to know that your city fiber department is in no way a competitive business. If it was, your salespeople would communicate better. If it was, you would install things in a timely manner. It's just the way it goes. Would anybody like a copy?
Sure, you can leave that here. I appreciate that. Bob, thank you for the comments. Since this is not agendized, we can't discuss it. Yeah.
I expect that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Next agenda item is approval of the minutes. Did anybody have comments on the minutes of June 7th? Is there a motion to approve?
Move to approve the minutes.
Second.
For the,
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, Judith, you too?
I'm abstaining because I wasn't
Okay, all right, okay. And any comments on the minutes of July 12th?
I just have one. On the first page, because Baltimore Gas and Electric had the most advanced program of any utilities that were there, and then some of the most innovative, it's not utilities, were located, community solar projects were located in Colorado.
Okay. All right, any other comments on the minutes? Is there a motion to approve the minutes with Judith's edits?
I move to approve the minutes with the edits.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, done. Did you folks get the edits? Yeah. Okay, all right. Or you can grab them from me. Thank you. Any comments on the agenda? Changes on that? Okay. Reports from commissioner meetings or events? Judith?
So I was at the National Town Meeting in Washington, D.C., which now that ADS has merged with SEPA, was now renamed the Grid Evolution Summit. And I just want to encourage that Palo Alto is a member of SEPA, and I just, would encourage the utility to send people to this event because I think it's a really good one, and it covers a lot of both policy and implementation issues that I think could be very helpful. A lot of the discussion that I thought was particularly relevant for us was that a lot of the advances, particularly around the integration of distributed energy resources, was very much in the conversation. And what I have observed is that what were sort of considered far out ideas several years ago are now seen as very commonplace, and that lots of people are doing these different things. And so having AMI infrastructure, being able to use the data, what do you do with the data, how do you use it to do a better job of integrating renewables, how do you deal with the topics of electrification of transportation came up a lot, and so having kind of the baseline infrastructure to be able to take advantage of what's new and happening and being proven in multiple places, that it would be great if that could be part of our infrastructure planning as well. And I know that's part of what's being talked about in the strategic plan, but I just think it was reinforcing. The other thing that was that had clearly evolved was that people are much more, it's just sort of much more a given that time variant pricing will be there. One of the issues that came up that I think, again, is a place where we could potentially be a leader since we don't have anything to replace is that the time variant pricing of the past was not assuming the duck curve and the glut of generation at certain parts of the day. And so one of the things that we talked about in several sessions was that maybe there needs to be discussion about how do you encourage people to use electricity at certain times of day, so that you may want to set it up so that you give people a pricing incentive to charge their cars and do things while the prices on the market are negative. And so, I think that because we've been a little, I'll call it behind the curve, we have to make sure that when we finally do adopt some of these practices that we're recognizing how things have shifted and we don't want to do the old version, we want to do the new version. And so, and there also had a discussion that I went to with the 51st State group, which is one of the SEPA initiatives. And again, I think it's really good if we can be part of that discussion, because I think it will be useful for our utility to be talking to the people who are really on the leading edge of things, so we don't have to follow, but rather can leapfrog maybe into what some of the things are that are based on lessons learned.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next agenda item, Director of Utilities report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the Commission, I actually have a few items to report on, so if you bear with me. First, in terms of something you might have noted in the media with our unveiling of new solar panels on our 2 downtown garages and electric vehicle charging stations. We did an announcement and a press event on July 24th. And we noted that these new charging stations will be powered with renewable energy generated on site. Ceremony was held at the Bryant Street parking garage to celebrate this occasion, with the 240 kilowatt solar canopy at this site owned and operated by Comuna Energy, our partner through a Palo Alto Clean PPA. And the electricity produced is sold back to City of Palo Alto Utilities through our feed-in tariff program. It's the first operational project in this clean program and moves the city toward our goal of 1.3 megawatts of solar capacity in our 4 city-owned parking structures, both downtown as well as near California Avenue, that will be completed over the next few months, as well as 18 new electric vehicle chargers in capacity for an additional 20. Let's see. So as a part of this unveiling, we also ensured that we got the word out on the city's charge for charging, and that we are implementing our efforts in order to make it easy to get access to our electric vehicle chargers by expanding both the infrastructure as well as encouraging turnover by the implementation of our modest charges. The new fee is 23 cents per kilowatt hour, which was implemented yesterday on August 1st. We're also, this is done through ChargePoint, the vendor managing the equipment and the payment system, which allows individuals to receive a mobile notification once a charging session is complete. And there will be a 20-minute grace period to move their vehicle, after which there's a $2 per hour fee for fully charged vehicles that remain attached to the chargers. This fee is intended to support expansion as well as use of our public EV charging facilities through cost recovery in order to cover ongoing maintenance. More information on the city's electric vehicle initiatives, including our interactive map of charging station locations, is on the city's website, cityofpaloalto.org/electric vehicle. Now, turning to recycled water. We have a recycled water project grant and loan funding applications that we're putting together for 2 funding opportunities to extend our recycled water system to the Stanford Research Park. One is an application of approximately $9 million in grant funds under a new federal program called the Water Infrastructure Improvement for the Nation. I won't try to figure out the acronym for that one. The other is a $36 million loan from the California Clean Water State Revolving Fund, which provides below-market interest rate for financing projects such as our recycled water projects. Either of these funding opportunities would improve recycled water business case set to be completed in September. The applications do not commit the city at this point to policy decisions by council, but are nonetheless keeping us in the queue. Point on cap and trade. Hopefully all have heard that Governor, have heard, the Governor signed AB 398, the state's cap and trade bill for greenhouse gas emissions, into law on July 25th. This extends the cap and trade program to 2030, originally set to expire in 2020. Among features, the program continues to use direct allowances to utilities. City of Palo Alto uses revenue from the sale of surplus allowances to promote programs such as energy efficiency and to purchase renewable energy. Some of the allowances are allocated to the gas utilities. Some of the allowances allocated to the gas utility are used to meet our compliance obligations. As required by the cap and trade regulations, remaining allowances are sold, and staff intends to use revenues to purchase offsets to supply the carbon neutral program and fund gas efficiency programs. Upcoming or pending legislation, SB 649, the Wireless Telecommunications Facilities bill that is currently in the legislature. This is a bill sponsored by wireless companies to deploy prospectively 5G technology in the state. In order to do so, and place their equipment on various poles owned and maintained by cities through California. To ease the path for these companies, SB 649 seeks to streamline permitting, leasing, and financial policies as they apply to locally owned poles. The City of Palo Alto originally noted concerns about this bill, how it might compromise worker safety and utility reliability, but successfully worked through NCPA, the Northern California Power Agency, to lobby for amendments to address those issues. There remain other concerns from the citywide perspective as to how this impacts the city's ability to enforce permitting and design approval processes for antenna and associated box-like equipment on streetlights, utility, and other poles in the public right-of-way. As a result, the city as a whole continues a position in consultation also with the League of California Cities. Let's see, one last note with respect to an ongoing program that is launching, the SunShares program. We will be launching within the next week. The city is participating in the 3rd year of Bay Area SunShares, which is a solar group buy program administered by the Building Council for Climate Change, or BC3. Residents and employees of companies in Palo Alto, along with 40 other Bay Area communities, are eligible to participate. Program still, I think, identifying its final details, but provides group buy discounts through 3 solar installers, and negotiations are in progress with vendors to potentially include, or definitely include, EV charging equipment, and I think there is some ongoing discussion with respect to zero-emission vehicles as well. SunShares will run for a limited time, with registration expected to open on August 7th through November 10th. Contracts for PV installations to be signed by the end of the calendar year. participation in this solar group buy program is part of our local solar plan. And I know we also have information on that in our website. That completes my report for this month, so it's an active month.
All right, thank you. Feels odd to say we have no unfinished business. We never finish anything, but let's go on to our first agenda item, which is the study session between the council and the UAC. And we do have a citizen comment. Jeff, do you want to start the discussion for us?
Sure. So when you have your meeting with council, I think one of the things that you should do is to ask whose job is it to make sure that they are annual? Because this one has 2 years and 4 months later than the previous one. And, well, enough said maybe. It seems to me that more important than talking about any particular topics for utilities to do would be sort of the meta topic of what does UAC need to do its job? And I've suggested some things in the past. One is, how about verbatim minutes? Council gets verbatim minutes, the Planning and Transportation Commission gets verbatim minutes. Council member Schmidt asked for them at the last joint session. So it would be really handy for him if he could just read through such a thing in 20 minutes rather than listening to a 2 or 3 or 4 hour video. And my understanding is that it doesn't cost a lot more. That's why council decided to do it for council, is because they think it's cost effective. Another thing is there a formal mechanism in place now so that if UAC wants to agendize an item, they can do it? Or do they simply have to ask staff and staff can decide whether to agendize it or not? Also, when you agendize an item, is it going to be an action item or not? Because if it's just a discussion, it's pretty hard for council to get your advice about what you as a body think, rather than what each individual commissioner says during the time that he or she speaks. From the last session, there are a number of important topics, and UAC decided to make a subcommittee for each important topic, which I think has not turned out very well, just because it hasn't resulted in colleagues' memos that UAC can consider and discuss as a body. So how can important topics get focused by the whole UAC, and if a subcommittee can help that process, okay, but I haven't seen it so far. As far as specific projects, undergrounding, at the last UAC meeting, Commissioner Schwartz thought that maybe it was time to take undergrounding off the plate as something the city even cares about. And I think before you do that, maybe you should ask council where they're at about that. It's not only about electric reliability, it's about aesthetics and property values, and the fact that the city ever so long ago promised all of its citizens that it was going to happen 100% over the years. So that deserves a discussion at a high level, I believe. The so-called second transmission line, which in fact I think would be a fourth transmission line, I think council has to be clear on whether that's still worth doing or not. And it's not exactly clear to me how UAC's watching it on a monthly basis is going to make it happen any faster. But if council thinks that it will, that's fine. Then the next question is, well, how is UAC going to make it happen faster? Fiber to the premises, I will leave for another occasion. You know how I feel about that. Since the last joint session, Commissioner Eglash tried very hard to set up a mechanism whereby important topics can be advanced more easily. And turns out that his fellow commissioners didn't really agree with his particular plan. But maybe council would think that some kind of plan is worth attempting. In the case of the drought, UAC decided to agendize it each month, whether there was anything to say about it or not. And I don't know if that had any effect, but at least it gave the opportunity at each meeting for UAC to make some comments if there were any to make. That's probably not the best idea for all these other topics, but it's, your job to figure out what is a better idea. And the website right now, as far as the subcommittees and the important topics are concerned, it just sits there. It's more than a year old. Is it anybody's job to update that? And would it help if you could click on each of the important topics and go to some place that has a more up-to-date description of the status of that topic? Thanks very much.
And Jeff, thank you very much. Just add one comment on this question about agendizing items. I think the way it's been working this last year is that if we want something on the future calendar, we bring it up in that part of the meeting, and it's been put on the calendar, and we have dialogue as to how much time is needed for preparation. So I think that's working better than it had in the past. I appreciate that. So we have this joint study session. Ed, do you your team want to start with any comments on that?
Sure. We don't have a presentation, but just simply to perhaps note that the report that we gave you is basically a foundation that could be used to present some foundational information for your joint session with council. It goes through prior years' accomplishments and then talks about the two topics moving forward, primarily the strategic plan and some of the subtopics that were identified in your last session, and then really the calendar, which is a bit of a litany of topics that will be coming. But if nothing else, I think it demonstrates the docket and the magnitude of the workload ahead. And so to what extent the UAC would like to raise specific issues that you'd like to have the council's perspective on. We could certainly queue up the version of this report that adds, any specific topics you'd like to be a focus of your discussion with the council.
Okay. Great. Anybody want to start the discussion? Judith?
So one thing I want to just comment on is that since I was the one that was really pushing for more of a workshop setting that the public could be involved in, that we didn't get to have any input into when the date would be, and it got scheduled when I can't be here. And I just want to say that if the point is to have us listening to the public, then I think it's important that we at least get to weigh in. If a quorum can come and it's a day I can't come, then that's fine. But the fact that we didn't even get asked strikes me as problematic for the purpose of of doing it. And then the other thing, it is my experience that the public doesn't just automatically show up. Okay, that you have to actively do things that get people to participate. And the best processes that I've worked on is when you have people identified in the community who are leaders in particular areas. So for example, we'd want to make sure that we reached out to Actera and asked them to bring a group to participate. There in Palo Alto, we have different neighborhood associations for different neighborhoods. I think it would be, worth going to the team captains and the people who do block parties and things like that to get them to invite people. So I going to the business community, the Chamber of Commerce. So I think that it needs to be more than just have a date. And so I think there needs to be more best practice around that process.
And I'd like to perhaps comment on that. Commissioner Schwartz is referring to the September 14th tentative date for the strategic planning community meeting. I think it's noted on the top of page 3 of your report. So a couple of comments there. I think the question of the role that the UAC would like to play in that community workshop is open for discussion. As it happens, based on both the feedback we've received from Commissioner Schwartz as well as staff discussion, we think it may actually work better to push that out a bit. So perhaps first week in October, if that would work logistically. As it happens, the commission has a meeting that week. And either to add a meeting that week if we did it on Thursday, or potentially even in lieu of the regular commission meeting that Wednesday on the 4th of October. So that would hopefully maximize the likelihood that the commissioners could make it, since that hopefully is a date that's already on your calendar. So that said, that was just a couple of dates that we looked at. But back to the original point, the question of the role the UAC would have, I think is important one for us to have some clarity on, both in preparation for the meeting as well as at the meeting. The date is, as much as anything else, I think going to be driven by our consultants' availability, and really the thought we had based upon the UHC feedback earlier was that we'd want to get it to a point where we have some material that the community at large could react to, rather than have it be more blank slate. And it looked like that late September, probably early October timeframe would work better than mid-September. So that just some comments for your consideration.
Okay, then the other thing is there was an article in the Merck the other day about co-housing projects that are happening locally. And I just want to emphasize that I think, I've been thinking a lot about what was made at the comment made at the last meeting, that 30 to 50% of the utility staff is going to retire in the next 5 years. And I think, and so I was talking to people in Washington about this, and we're not the only utility facing that. And so I think that this is a really important thing. And so looking at, maybe co-housing opportunity is the way to do it, doing a program with Foothill College, with Stanford, with other local colleges to try and see what we can do to attract people who are already tied to the area in some way or familiar with the area to come and be part of it. I think that the utility industry as a whole has not necessarily communicated the heroic nature of what people in utilities do to keep the lights on, and how it really is interesting. And I know, I'm a little wonky, and I think this stuff is really fun and cool, and but I think that this is really a big part of, the future of what it is going to mean for American society. And to have, it's all well and good to talk about sustainability and what you want to do, but if you don't have people to operate the system, it's not really going to be very effective. And I think that there are more things, again, just hoping people show up is not necessarily the thing. And I think we just have to make sure that where people are going to live, even if it's just apartments, even if they have something on the weekend, but if we're trying to attract younger people who maybe don't need a whole house for a family, whatever, that we could do something creative and take advantage of one of these organizations that is actually are managing these kind of housing developments, because I think younger people we're seeing don't have the same need to own their own car and have their own house.
So Judith, first, I agree these are good topics, and actually discussed some of this with Ed after the meeting last month, not as extensive as you're thinking. But I'm going to bring this back to the agenda for a little while.
Okay, well, I just think that ought to be part of the study session is my point.
Staffing issues, and how solutions for staffing issues, including the technical.
Right, and so I think they're interrelated for some of the other things that we're doing. I also, okay, so that's, and again, as I said in the last meeting, I think the idea of focusing on reliability as a larger issue for us to look at in the joint study session is an important thing. Because I think we haven't been looking at how things fit together. We've been looking at things in a more siloed, piecemeal fashion.
All right. So, my understanding is from the study session, we're not going to get formal council policy, but we'll get viewpoints of different council members on policy issues to the extent we get them surfaced there. We'll get viewpoints of individual council members on areas they want us to focus on, and we may want to put questions about there as council members want us to focus on X, Y, or Z. And then the style of the study session could be briefing for the council and the UAC on key points. And in that respect, Judith, what you brought up about this being a near to midterm issue or midterm issue coming up about staffing and resources for Palo Alto, maybe that's worth a few minutes of the study session, Ed, to remind the council and the UAC of that, what's being faced.
Was it just a passive thing where I mean, I didn't go to the last one because, as Jeff pointed, it occurred before I joined, and then there wasn't one since then. So are we just supposed to be passive and just do whatever the council says and not come up with anything that we think should happen? I guess I'm asking Councilman Philseth if, I mean, do I not understand what the study session is supposed to be?
I think the UAC has a huge amount of latitude over what they want to talk with the council about. I think, strategies for staffing in the long run, given that it's sort of escalated to one of the concerns, is fair game to talk about with the city council. I mean, I think it's not an issue that's unique to the utilities, right? But I think it could be part of the discussion.
Yeah, Judith, I wasn't saying we can't bring anything up. We got to figure out how we make this most productive. In the past, those are some of the things that we did. We're getting guidance on what topics are of interest in the council members for us to pursue, guidance on policy, understanding of policy views, and then we can bring up whatever we want. Partly to help us determine the agenda for the following year on that.
And since I know I can't be there, this is my chance to get you guys to talk about it.
Okay, right. Yeah. So I agree, and we have talked about the staffing is a major thing, and it's worth comment on.
Yes, and in fact, if it's helpful, I might refer your attention to the attachment on that report, attachment B, which is the memo we have from our consultant on the strategic plan. And so it encapsulates in basically 2 pages. So you've got the memo and the series of bullets thereafter. And at the top of page 2, it is, certainly listed organizational, operational, and workforce issues. And so identifies a number of sub-bullets that if this were a helpful framework, and I think part of the question for discussion tonight would be if this adequately captures many of the issues. I don't think it could be comprehensive, but it can capture many of the issues and provide something of a frame for here are some of the major topics that we see as important for the utility, both in terms of its strategic planning effort as well as for communication to the council in terms of some of the policy issues that council could give you some feedback on. Whether this is the right outline or not, I think, again, could be helpful to discuss tonight. And perhaps to Commissioner Schwartz's point, as it relates to reliability, whether it's been adequately captured. It's described, perhaps one point here is this resiliency under climate change, and that may not be the right sort of framing as you pointed it out. Mm-hmm. To maybe swapped in some ways, the focus on reliability from a utility perspective, and climate change is one of the factors in ability to provide reliability as a system, as opposed to the other way around.
AC?
I do think the attachment from the consultants is a good list of issues. The ones that have found the most interesting in our discussion over the last couple of meetings have been these really resiliency issues. And I mean, you mentioned community solar, but I think and that's a specific program, but I think that the resiliency issues are really much broader, and you capture some of them in here: storage, microgrids. I'm also think would be good to start talking about, how we're going to move forward on smart metering and so on. I mean, you're telling us this is coming, but it seems like it's still a ways down the road, and there's an awful lot of things that we could do if we had that technology that we want to do, it seems to me.
Is this on? Yeah. Let's see, a couple of thoughts. Given that this is an action item and the recommendation is that we approve this report as the basis for the joint study session, I'm focused on, to me, a basis of a study session is an agenda, which this report isn't quite. But there are 4 bullet points that look to me like an agenda, and I just wanted to suggest that from my point of view, they're in kind of the reverse order of the order in which I'd like to talk about them with City Council. I think the discussion, a two-way discussion of Council giving us direction on its priorities and what it wants for us, as well as an opportunity for us to raise issues with Council. And community solar is given here as an example. And when we talked about community solar a while back, I forget, 1 or 2 or 3 months ago, I feel like what really surfaced was a policy issue that staff was pursuing community solar based on a directive from City Council to pursue 4% local solar generation. And what the UAC was bringing up was we're not so sure anymore that that's a good policy objective, given the duck curve and how the grid has changed and how that might stress it and how the economics of it don't pencil out. And so I feel like what we want to be discussing isn't community solar necessarily in and of itself, but that as an example of an initiative that might not make sense because the 4% local solar is a thing that might not make sense. So I think it'd be great if we could just frame the discussion that way. But I think talking about the electric integrated resource plan is a great idea. Talking about the strategic planning process is a great idea. I don't know that we're going to want to spend much time looking in the rearview mirror at 2017. And then I just had one comment on the memo, because I don't see anything on here about drought. And I just want to raise the issue, the same issue I raised last session with the consultant, that I think it's worth spending a little bit of time on the thought exercise of, what if another 5-year, 10-year drought is around the corner? And how do we think about the future of water availability as well as hydroelectric power availability and it's kind of under the climate change heading. But I think that could be a good thing to talk about as well.
The way I approach this or think about it is sort of different categories, and some of these have come up. One would be, as Lisa said, a category is council direction on UAC priorities. That should be an agenda item for the study session. A second area would be however you want to phrase it, discussion of policy views. And an area we identified, and Lisa touched on that as well, is how much do we subsidize local solar, whether it's rooftop or community solar, and what are the reasons for subsidizing it? And I think it would be helpful to hear have a discussion of that and hear viewpoints from council members as to that. And that should be preceded by a short summary that says, here's what it cost if the city to produce community solar, rooftops, for people to produce rooftop solar, and our utility scale solar from the Central Valley, including transmission costs. How much are we willing to subsidize these higher cost sources? That would be one policy area we ought to get direction on. To the extent it factors, it doesn't, some of the other things that don't factor into day-to-day or month-to-month discussions, but factor in the budget would be, is there policy guidance, back to Jeff's point, on how much to spend on undergrounding? Is there policy guidance on how much to spend to promote EVs, specifically with chargers? I don't know what else we can do so much to promote that. I don't know what other areas we might want to get an airing of policy views.
So I think that to speak to the issue that you just brought up, so cost is one issue, okay? But if you look at it in a more holistic fashion, the value of having that generation that's closer into the city may have value that doesn't have to do with cost. So you don't want to only have the price per kilowatt hour to be the only thing you look at. So if you're setting it up so that city buildings can run in an islanded fashion if there's a major earthquake, okay, and they can have inverters that allow this thing to be a separate island, and so the city services can keep going, that may be a reason to do it. That has, and so I think that is I think the policy perspective needs to be that we can look at things other than just cost. We can look at, there may be reasons where we say we don't want to do it because it costs too much, but if there's congestion in the transmission, we're going to get curtailment, and it won't, and you won't necessarily be having the electrons coming up here even during the time when the solar is producing. And again, they made a policy issue, a discussion around electrification of buildings, okay, that didn't take into account the idea that if you're using electricity at night and in the morning, it's not coming from our solar plant. So, I think that one of the things that is challenging is that the city council has a lot to cover, and they can't be expert on everything. And it seems to me that our value added is to help focus attention on some of the things that they might not have time to think about while they're doing their policy discussions, because there are things that sound good in principle that don't necessarily make sense when you're looking at on a practical basis of what does it take to deliver it. So I think to the extent that the discussion can be including staff on what's really practical and work, that would be a very valuable thing.
By the way, I agree with you. Cost is not the only value, and it'd be worthwhile to hear from city council members what else they would value. Now, the UAC's technical expert, Arnie Valentine, is not here tonight. He's stranded in Asia somewhere, but he's explained to us that we don't get resiliency benefit from this rooftop or community solar. It doesn't keep the grid powered.
But that's if it's not, It can be if it's designed that way. So it's just that inverters you don't want to have solar put on the system, just general, but if you design a microgrid so that it's designed to be for a unit that it can operate alone, that can be done. So I think you may be misinterpreting what Arnie said and interpreting it too broadly. If somebody from the utility wants to add to that?
I was just going to...
confirming it's accurate.
I was just going to... But I think this is what makes it a really great topic to discuss with City Council, because we don't know what the thinking was behind 4% local solar, and if it was, the objective was carbon neutrality, if the objective was resiliency, if the objective, I doubt it was financial, but given given what the objective, if it's resiliency, subsidizing storage might be a better option. Or, if we just feel good having panels on our rooftops, then, it's going to stand under any circumstances. I think that's what makes it a good topic, to find out sort of what are our more specific sustainability, carbon neutrality, resiliency, what are the objectives?
So Ed, I think, I'm sorry, please.
So none of us was there when this happened, I think, but I'm gonna take a guess here that when that goal was set, nobody really had any idea what it was going to cost in order to reach it and so forth, and there was undoubtedly some interest in getting there, and somebody did little more than throw a dart and say, let's give this a try. So I think it's a reasonable question to ask, is this a good time that we should revisit that, and in light of things we've learned in the meantime.
That's a good point. There's been turnover in the council as well as a lot of developments in the market. And I guess the way it could be opened up would be data on cost of relevant sources, some discussion of of do these stay turned on, do they help when the grid is down? And if not, why, and what would have to be done to change that? That's useful background. And then a list of other benefits people have cited. The psychic benefit of seeing it there, or the educational benefit, or the benefit of shading, or whatever. But list all those. And then we can ask the council how much, I guess I would also list what are we required to do under state law, and how much more does Palo Alto policy advocate above that currently. So that would be, that'd be good background for this study session.
Yeah. So we can speak to a lot of those topics. Queue up some information on that. As far as state obligations, what's remaining right now is that we offer net energy metering to up until we reach the net energy metering cap. It's about a megawatt left. Beyond that, there really aren't any serious mandates out there from a state perspective. I'd also note in the local solar plan, one of the important principles in that plan was that none of the programs should create any subsidies from other ratepayers. So we've been holding to that in the development of the local solar plan.
Oh, then we can't do it. There's no way to do it without subsidies from other ratepayers, because you're doing it at a loss, right?
Well, right. The community solar, for example, is a subscription program. So the ratepayers who want to buy the community solar pay for it, for example.
Okay, but the proposal we had didn't have people paying for the full cost of that energy, as I understood it.
I'm going to turn to
if you position it as a premium program like Palo Alto Green was, and people know they're doing it as a premium program, then they're covering the costs.
Okay. Maybe we could be prepared to speak to those questions when at the August 21st
that would be fine.
meeting.
So I think to preface that discussion for the council, I'm saying this is the kind of information that should be presented, and then people can have an informed discussion about what are the values of these things. And I see even all of us aren't fully informed. We've had the benefit of several discussions with you, so that would be good. So I started off a while ago, different categories of what could happen. There'd be what are council direction on UAC priorities, policy discussions, and maybe really, rather than multiple policy discussions, we have this one on how much do we subsidize local solar, what's the value in it relative to other sources of electricity that we get. And then a third topic could be information that we want the council to be aware of, to draw their attention to. And Judith brought up the one about the whole workforce plan, or Terry did. Yes?
At risk of flogging that one just a little tiny bit more, a real back of envelope is that, currently to get local solar to happen, we need to subsidize it about 7 cents a kilowatt hour. total electricity consumption in the city is about 900,000 megawatts. So if you multiply 4% times $70 times 900,000, you get about $2.5 million a year. And so the question is, local solar basically is, to that 4% is costing us about $2.5 million a year. And so the kind of things that we ought to discuss are, how much resilience are we getting? What are other factors? Who's paying the $2.5 million a year? Fundamentally, is it worth it? I mean, I think that's the kind of thing that.
Yeah, thank you. And trading it off against energy efficiency measures and the like.
Storage.
I personally would like to see an attitude where any particular program, we're comparing all the alternatives. It's a sort of a cap and trade kind of way of looking at things on that. But if we bucket things like that, UIC priorities, policy about the local solar and the like, and all the considerations that go into that, don't want to exclude any of them, and then information we want to bring to the council's attention. Let's talk about that last one for a moment. I think several people have mentioned the staffing, future staffing crisis. I think we want the council to be aware of the strategic planning process, but we don't need to bore them with that in great detail. It's going to be a lot of interesting discussion coming along. What other topics would you like to, or things would you like to bring to the council and make sure they're aware of, they know we're paying attention to, or we want them to be?
So I guess the kind thing for me to say is I think we're completely going about this the wrong way. I think it's great to brainstorm on these things, but the major question I have is what Jeff raised at the start. Why is it 2 years and 4 months since we had this meeting? And I think it is incumbent on us to make this meeting relevant and to fit for the needs of the council members. I don't think we want to cover a big range of issues. I want what I see the staff proposed. List what's happened since the last meeting. List what we're planning on doing. And in between, pick one major topic, and I think it's got to be the strategic plan, because that's so relevant to them. They're going to have community members showing up as part of all this. They're going to want to know what we're doing for that kind of a big, enormous kind of meeting. And that's all I would do.
Well,
Judith has mentioned it. They cover such a big range of issues. I am not going to put a council member over a barrel and say, well, should we be subsidizing this, or what's the right way to do things? They get agenda items for each one of these things when they come up. But I think it's really unfair to try to put them over the barrel on individual issues.
So I sharply disagree on the last point.
Yeah.
We have policy that was set some years back by other people on the council. We have a better understanding of these issues now. We're all 100% clean electricity, never mind the trade-offs for a moment. And this is an issue, we're not going to get formal policy out of the council, but I think a lot of us have identified this as something we want to surface and hear viewpoints, because it affects so much of what comes up on our agenda. And they won't be put on the spot. They'll know in advance what's coming. And there'll also be a pre-meeting with the mayor and deputy mayor and Arnie and I and Judith, just to set things up for the meeting, so that we will be hopefully responsive to their needs as well. But I do think that's a topic I've wanted to see discussed with them for a long time, and there's no other forum to do that except the joint session. I don't disagree with the rest of your comments.
If I could suggest that the structure, in fact, that Commissioner Turnbull described can achieve that goal. And as we talk about what's upcoming, clearly it's a strategic plan, and that will be work to come, but it basically has a framework to it. And you've also got your other items on the upcoming agendas. So within even the context of the strategic plan, but also more broadly with our integrated resource planning, to raise the topic of, or to inform the council that the commission is somewhat struggling, I guess I'll use that term, with the question of how far to go with community solar as an example, recognizing that from your prior discussion, I think you effectively had consensus that it doesn't seem to pencil out. And not sure that there's a value proposition, so to speak, with the program as presented. And to get some feedback from council, it wouldn't be direction and it wouldn't be, in all likelihood, very definitive, but could give you a sense of whether they say, we really think we ought to keep pushing on that because it's really important to provide other opportunities for local solar, or in contrast, perhaps just a recognition of, good point. I don't think any of us are really locked into community solar as the way either to get to the 4% or resilience or, what have you in terms of the initial goals. Some of them may also disavow having not been on the council at the time that the direction was presented. And I suspect you'll hear from the council a very clear willingness to entertain whatever recommendations the commission wants to bring forward as you do deeper dives on this specific topic as well as others. And we would suggest we take that feedback, again, depending on how it plays out, and then organize what we present to you in the strategic plan, in your upcoming agenda items that reflect that feedback.
Okay. Thank you on that. I view this document here as not, I think it's useful background, but it's not an agenda. And so I think there does need to be an agenda, and maybe that will come out of some of the pre-meeting, reflecting on ideas that have been raised here, and the areas of interest that strategic plan, staffing, subsidies, et cetera, and anything else. And maybe what I'd ask that if any commission members have particular ideas on, here's an information item or a policy issue or a question we want to have on that agenda, to send them to Arnie or me or Judith or Ed in the next week, and we'll try to see that gets reflected on that. And then we'll have a interesting attachment, and perhaps also an overview of the strategic plan, and then a separate agenda to help guide the discussion on that. Does that make, folks? Does that make sense? We're not. The idea is not to exclude anything, but to make sure we have a useful discussion. All right.
Can I just save myself the trouble of emailing you later, mention a couple of things?
Please, that's why we're having this discussion.
I really
Absolutely.
like Jeff's idea of verbatim minutes, personally.
Okay.
So I don't know, I don't know if it's the most important thing for us to talk about with City Council, but if it's an easy thing to change, that's something I would personally appreciate. And then we haven't talked much about fiber. We've been pretty focused on solar in our discussions here, but I would really like to hear council's thoughts on their priorities. I mean, kind of similar in spirit. Is this something we believe in to the point that we might want to subsidize it? Or is it something that's like, we'll only ever do it if we can make a business case? And I think that's a real clear policy bifurcation, and I would love to hear from council how they think about it.
Yeah. And I suppose how they think about it could also be how they would like the issue presented to them if we were to work it up.
Because we did work on it, because that was from the last study session. We were asked to work on that as a subcommittee, and Mike and I did, and we came up with some stuff that we could, so I would hate to think we're back at square one still. I thought we've progressed since, since then.
At least they presented it in a very interesting way. How much should the city subsidize this, I think was what I heard, and that's not a question I've really had discussed with the council.
And on that topic, I think it'd be helpful to get some direction from the council, what they want the UAC to be doing as opposed to the Citizens Advisory Committee on Fiber. I mean, there are two groups that are kind of looking at this. It's not clear to me what the division of responsibility is.
Okay. Excellent. Other thoughts on questions to bring up? And anything else that comes by email, send to Arnie or me, we'll make sure things are disseminated in proper Brown Act fashion on that. So any further discussion on that agenda item? Okay. That gets us to, we're not too far behind here. Item 2, discussion of developing a flexible distributed energy resource plan and forecasting. And you're going to teach us a bit now.
Commissioners, thank you. I wanted to introduce Shiva Swaminathan, Senior Resource Planner with the Utilities Resource Management Division, who's going to give the staff presentation and talk to you about distributed energy resources.
Thank you, Jonathan. Shiva Swaminathan. Shiva Swaminathan, Senior Resource Planner. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge a number of team members who work on these distributed energy resources day in, day out. I'd like to recognize Sonika Chowdhury, who is in the audience today. Monica Padilla has helped in many ways to develop the local solar plan from 2014. Lena Perkins, Eric Wong, and many other folks from our utility program services do provide a lot of services for customers on DER as we speak. But this is to kind of lay out, okay, where are we going from here? So you have a report in front of you. This is to hit on some of the highlights and to seek your feedback. So we'll provide a overview, and then we are seeking your input on certain strategic principles. Many of them, perhaps we just talked about, should we subsidize, not, so on and so forth. Hopefully, it'll lay out a framework to discuss this for the future. So we'll talk about what is distributed energy resources, how do we incorporate the impact of the DERs in our loads, and the framework we just talked about, and about next steps. So DER, as we commonly know, has three main characteristics. It's typically deployed at customer premises in the distribution system, or could be also done by the utilities directly connecting to the distribution system. It has a potential to change the character of the loads we are serving, the seasonality, the peaks, and so on. And its potential to, it replaces the central generation, which we generally procure. And it does improve resiliency. To what extent, it's to be debated. So these are the main characteristics, and you see at the bottom kind of the supply through to the customer. So this is a list all of you are aware of. These are the main, as we consider it, distributed energy resource. Some folks, energy efficiency and conservation, they do not necessarily consider them DER, but we are kind of looping that in as well. And one thing which is kind of we are emphasizing recently is the heat pump water heaters and heat pump space heating as part of the electrification effort. So those technologies also provide us mechanisms to leverage these resources as we deploy them. So we can consider them also as part of DER. They're in a sense storage devices too, because they store heat using electricity. So in terms of DER adoption so far, we are not making a new start. We have discussed this many times with the council and the community. So when we support DERs in the past, it's either state mandated or it's cost effective from a societal perspective. So for example, solar, which was mandated by the state on SB 1 10 years ago. We were required to subsidize it by $13 million over 10 years. That subsidy is over, and it's based on that. When it ended, the subsidy ended 2 or 3 years ago. That's when the council adopted the local solar plan to say no more subsidy, but we'll have to facilitate. So the community solar plan, which you all received and discussed, did not have a subsidy in it. It was above market costs, but it was designed to serve a customer segment who are willing to pay more for that resource. So our local solar plan and none of our staff plans calls for a subsidy from other ratepayers. So I was perplexed by some of the discussion earlier today.
But there are a lot of elements in that plan that talked about city expenditures, and it wasn't clear from the presentation they're all going to be wrapped into the rate.
Right. So I think Commissioner Dan, I think you framed that, included the above market costs the customers were going to pay, along with some of the staff costs. Yes. So that's from a societal perspective. Yes, it's higher cost, but customers, to the extent customers value it more and are willing to pay more, that's their cost effectiveness. So just the next few bullets is to outline other local solar or distributed energy resource plans the council has already approved or you have seen before: the local solar plan, electrification work plan, use of low carbon fuel standard money to support EV chargers, the 10-year energy efficiency goals, and then recently the energy storage assessment, which we found it to be not cost effective, so therefore we said not to do any programs related to that, except perhaps pilots. And all of this is also wrapped up within the sustainability plan with goals associated with them. So quickly going through some of the major major DER programs. Local solar PV, we all know about that. I don't have to speak more, except that to say that the local solar plan was developed in 2014 after the carbon neutral plan. So carbon neutral plan was before that, and the subsidies also ended. So it is in those two backdrops was the local solar plan developed. And there was a community interest for people. So only 1,000 or maybe 800 of our 25,000 residents have PV on their roofs currently. 800 out of 25,000. So there is a segment, and we have since our meeting, we've had a survey to kind of bring some of that information. There is a segment of our customer base who want solar, who are unable to put it on their roofs. So that's kind of broadly the PV local solar plan is to facilitate that process, not to subsidize. On energy efficiency, that's a top priority, cost-effective energy efficiency. We've had about 6.5% in the last 10 years through customer programs, and we've spent quite a few millions of dollars, $23 million on that. And we're hoping in the next 10 years we'll have an additional 5.7% reduction in load due to energy efficiency. Electric vehicles, we have quite a bit of penetration, about 1% of states' electric vehicles are in town, about 2,500 vehicles, and about a similar number of commute vehicles. In the report, there's a typo. It has 1,000 as the commute vehicles. We think it's more like 2,500. And it accounts, we think, again, these are estimates. It's hard to quantify accurately. About 0.7% of our current load is electric vehicle charging. Oh, thank you. We have a small demand response program for our large commercial customers, which reduces our peak load for the year by about 0.3%. And then we have a number of other programs in early stages. Heat pump water heaters, we have a pilot program ongoing with our public benefits fund. It's not cost effective, but with our public benefits funds, which support early stage projects, we are supporting or piloting heat pump water heaters. That's reducing the barriers, to reduce the barriers related to permitting, educating people, supply chain. So that is staff costs involved with that, but we think it's a good value of money given our customer profile and our community's emphasis on such programs. So those are broadly the the DERs as we support them now. So how does this impact? These are in the distribution system. So we, when we measure our electricity consumption at our city gate, these are kind of behind the customer meter, so we don't necessarily see what the impact of that on the load. So we try to estimate it using econometric forecasts of load, and then superimpose our estimates of these energy generated from these resources on top of it. And then we'll be doing the same when we develop the IRP for the period 2019 to 2030. So this is a regulatory requirement under SB 350. When we project that far out, 12 years out, as part of a public document, we'll have to make certain assumptions, but we also have to make the forecasts depend on council policy. If you're going to aggressively support we're not proposing, council had never supported subsidies for PV since local solar plan was approved in 2014, but if there is going to be a change, we'll have to incorporate that into our forecast of load and resources. So that's part of the reason we're bringing this up now for a discussion. So how do we use these forecasts? Primarily for 4 purposes. For supply resource planning, how much do we need to procure from out of town to bring it into town? For transmission planning, we send this to PG&E and CalISO for their transmission planning requirement. We are a taker of transmission services from the CalISO. We also use this internally for our distribution system planning. What's the feeder loading, how much distribution transformers do we need to support? And also to facilitate customer programs, which we have many. Next is an illustration of our loads over the past 16 years, as well as projection for the next 13. As you see, our energy load peaked in 2000 and 2001. Our current load is about 15% lower than it had been in 2001 for various reasons, mainly energy efficiency. But in the past 10 years, with photovoltaics and energy efficiency, our loads are about 7.5% lower than what it would have been before. Without energy efficiency, 6.5%, and with PV, 1%. That's a 7.5 you see there. And projecting forward, we think by 2030, our loads are going to be 5 to 15% lower, depending on different assumptions. Energy efficiency, if it takes off, there is net zero buildings coming up, new regulations, all new buildings have to be net zero energy. So with the impact of energy efficiency, PV, and electric vehicles, we think the net would be about 5 to 15% lower loads than current levels. This is again at a high level. We'll be refining this in the coming years. This is again a guesstimate that far out.
Are you assuming that the EV penetration continues to
Correct.
grow?
Yep. Yep. And so we think by 2030, currently it's 0.7%. By 2030, it's potentially 10% on the high side of energy will be consumed by electric vehicles. This is just an illustration of our distribution system. As we see from our Colorado substation, off of 101, we get 3 transmission lines coming in, and these are distribution substations, 9 of them distributing energy throughout the city. And we do not anticipate major investments, upgrades related to the distribution system, given that our loads are currently 15% below what they were able to be handled back 15 years ago. So, but there may be local distribution issues. If there is a neighborhood with 3 EVs, then there'll be distribution transformer upgrade required. We are doing some assessments now, but without AMI smart meters, we don't have much visibility of the overload. But we are comforted the recent heat wave, none of our distribution transformers failed, whereas some PG&E system distribution transformers failed. So we have a relatively robust system. We tended to, given our cost of equipment versus installation cost, is a ratio of like 1:5 equipment cost $1,000 was the installation $4,000. We tend to oversize it slightly because it plans for the future. So our distribution transformers are relatively good capacity currently. You'll hear more about that plan, assessment results, which Sonica and one of our interns are leading sometime early next year. So given all this background, given the experience we've had with solar, we thought it'll be good to kind of lay down some principles to guide our development of a DER going forward. And I think this will probably answer some of the questions we've talked about earlier today about subsidy and not. So we at a staff level think that the council local solar plan precludes subsidies. And so some of this kind of gets into part of that discussion. So the first one, we have 3 outlined in the report, ensures that both electric distribution system and utility rate structure can accommodate DER growth. That's on us. At a minimum, we want to facilitate customers to install them by ensuring our distribution system can handle it and that our rate structure is not an impediment. The second is more on trying to leverage and optimize what customers are installing by themselves, making sure it doesn't cause any harm, and also how can we use it for a greater community good. Given there's a few customers are putting it up, how can we leverage it for the community as a whole? That's number 2. For examples, for example, we talked about microgrid. Any customer who puts a PV in can, for their customer alone, that home alone, can do a microgrid. There are many customers we know in Palo Alto who have microgrids in their own homes. PV batteries to support their production and use over a period of time. When with more and more local resources down the road, not in the next 5-10 years, but down the road, if we have a large number of PVs, I don't know, 30-40% from the current 1%, if it grows to 30-40% of the city's load, perhaps there could be a localized smart grid which the utility can facilitate. Not anytime soon, we don't anticipate, but that's something for the future. So that's number 2. And number 3, to facilitate the role we currently play, and this is to kind of number 3, we'll play a facilitator role for DER, but it kind of has 2 flavors. One, when it is cost effective from a societal perspective, whether it's more cost effective than bringing supplies from out or upgrading our distribution transformer, we would use ratepayer money because it's societally cost effective, and to support the development of that DER resource. For example, energy efficiency, we support cost-effective energy efficiency that uses ratepayer funds. But on the second side, if it is not, the second bullet there is, if it is not cost-effective from a societal perspective, we would not be using ratepayer funds to provide rebates, but to facilitate. So there will be staff time to do the facilitation, reduce barriers, and help customers who want to do it for their own reasons. So these have been kind of the guiding principles even when we adopted the local solar plan in many ways. This is an outline of what we have experienced, but we thought it would be good to lay it out for council discussion and UAC discussion to see whether we think this provides a framework to support our plan going forward, including the local solar plan. So that's broadly. And then we looked at, okay, going forward, how do we want to look at this? As some of the discussion earlier today talked about DER, it's difficult to reward or send the right price signals without AMI. So we kind of looked at DER penetration in kind of several phases. So this shows a time versus DER penetration. Currently, the DER penetration is, say, relatively low, only 800 residential customers out of 25,000, and 2,500 EVs out of 50,000. But in stage one, which we think is the next 5 years before AMI comes into play, we have certain roles. Reduce barriers, pilot systems, with expectation things will catch up, and we don't want to be in a catch-up mode afterwards. And we are 10 years behind the rest of the state in terms of AMI infrastructure, for good reasons, I think. And so that's stage one. Stage two is AMI deployment. And once we have the AMI deployment with our own pricing signals, we can influence behavior and to optimize those systems. And then stage 2B, we call it, we can do that minimum and to send the price signals and get customers to behave optimally. And stage 3 is use those resources to transact in the marketplace, whether it's a transmission market or to provide distribution price signals. So the 5-year plan, the next 5 years until AMI is in place, would be primarily stage 1. And then as AMI and the markets develop more in the next 5 years, perhaps 22 forward, will be in different stages of stage 2A or 2B. This is kind of how we took this framework and adopted it for Palo Alto. This is a framework laid out by ISO a few months ago. We've adapted it to suit what we think. So we would like your input on this framework as we go forward as well. So that's about it. So we would, in terms of next steps, we seek your input today, and we will come up with a more fleshed out DER plan and implementation plan in the fall, in a couple of months. And we'll incorporate the DER forecast into the load forecast for the SB 350 requirements. And this is worked out in conjunction with the utility strategic plan to incorporate these findings as well as the direction from the strategic plan as we develop the DER plan for the next 5 years. So I would like to seek your feedback on 2 broad areas. One is the guiding principles as we've laid them out, and then on the framework of looking at the DER work plan. Thank you.
Thank you. That was just excellent. Appreciate that. How about questions from folks, comments? Yeah, go ahead.
Just a question. I mean, I don't want to go through the whole history of why we're behind the rest of the state on the AMI metering, but is there anything we could do to speed it up at this point, or we're basically 2021 is as early as we could expect to see it?
Just briefly on the history, in 2012, we did an assessment and found it to be not cost effective at that time. So council directed us not to make any investments, and we found the investments was $50 to $20 million required, but to defer it for 3 to 5 years, and we did some number of pilots to support some of the value propositions. So now we are in the process as part of a strategic plan as well as a technology roadmap, which some of the discussion will take place next month at the UAC meeting. So that's in the past. In the future, what's holding us back? Not much, except we are CIS system, our customer information systems, which is SAP currently, is in the process of getting upgraded. And the AMI system will have to talk to our customer information system. So we have to wait till the CIS system is in place, but we are hopeful that will happen in the next 2 to 3 years. And then after that is when AMI would happen. So that's kind of the timeline we are looking at 5 years out.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful to me.
So in terms of your general philosophy, that I like the phrase, you're facilitating distributed investment. You know, that having other people pay for it besides the city is a good thing. You know, that it's perfectly reasonable to have other entities, whether it's individuals or whatever, sort of if they want to make an investment. And So I think that's a good philosophy because, unless it's something that really there's a holistic good for doing it, I'm not sure we need to be subsidizing it. And though I do think that for certain things, if we want to have a fund that we can use to help people who want to do it, I think that's an okay thing to do too. I think in terms of DR happening sooner rather than waiting for phase 3, there are a couple of things that I'd just like to mention that I think might be useful for us. One is Ohm Connect, which is basically a voluntary solution, because I signed up for it. I first thought that when it's a software company up in San Francisco, and these guys have put together a way that you can participate even if you don't have a smart meter. You can still be part of their DR program, and then they send you little, tomorrow between 6 and 8, turn off a bunch of lights and things like that. So to the extent that we want to get people involved, that's something that could happen now. Another thing that I don't know the answer to, if it's really useful, but the Nest Rush Hour Rewards program, it seems to me that even if there's not a price signal, we could still potentially participate in that. And so I think given that they're a local Palo Alto company, that would be a really nice thing to talk to them about. I can give you the names of the guys if you're not already in touch with them, but I think that would be something that would be something to get people used to the idea of it and participating. Another technology option that we may want to do with the 800 families that we want to do a pilot is, have you heard of the Sonnen batteries? So they have basically a way that you can do peer-to-peer sharing with networks of things. So I think looking into some of those solutions that are on the market already could be an interesting way to get things started and get people where ahead of 5 years from now, which might make us more sophisticated when we did those other things. The other thing, I was just starting to read it this morning, and I didn't get all the way through it, but the Hawaiian Electric plan of how they want to do smart meter AMI in a very targeted way actually has a lot of relevance for us. And so I can send it to you, but it's really worth looking at it, and it's written in a really interesting, accessible way, and I think it might be interesting for us because I did have a client that was doing opt-in AMI. And so anyway, so just this idea, and Central Hudson is doing, so it's just something that would be worth looking at, that there might be some ways to accelerate some things in a rational way. So I offer that as things to add that might allow certain things to happen more quickly.
Excellent comments. Thank you. Thank you. Terry, anything else? Lisa?
Just wanted to say, express support for the guiding principles. It seems like a good place to start. I'm particularly happy to see stress tests on the list under ensuring that the distribution system and financial and pricing structures can accommodate DER growth. And I'm a little curious if you've already got an outline of sort of like what are the elements of the stress tests?
Yes, and that is different growth patterns is one. So it could rise by 20% our load potentially, and we should be able to handle it, and drop by 20%. That's a range of load growth. That's one. The other is how much in a particular neighborhood, how much distributed energy resources can we handle? Given our rules should be a little different than PG&E's because we have a relatively mild climate compared. So stress testing, how much can we handle? So putting some sensors on our distribution transformers to see how much we can handle. So stuff like that. We haven't fleshed it out completely, but those were the types of things we were looking at.
Yeah, I share the comments, very thoughtful. I think on the stage one, could put more specifics in there. For example, if part of the objective is to facilitate, it's also removing barriers. So more specifically, what can we do on permitting, for example? I don't know if permits are required if you're putting in place a Sonnen battery or a Tesla battery in your home or office, or how much of a barrier that is. So being specific about those sorts of things or examples would be good. Secondly, and we've talked about this before, other decisions are made now about distributed resources in the next 5 years that would be impactful later. For example, some chargers permit two-way transfer of vehicle to grid, and others don't. I don't know the answer, but if there are, then we'd preferentially prefer those that enable vehicle to grid, even if we're not going to turn it on for 5 years. And maybe the same about other kinds of DER resources on that. So future-proofing them is a way. So I think being specific about those and saying that's one of our goals, facilitate and remove barriers for future-proof. And I think you touched on it, enable experimentation. And we do have a fund for that, I think, and for new technology. I think that's great. I look forward to the time when you do have AMI. I'm sure it'll be very exciting for the department to have all those knobs to twist. And we'll take a smarter UAC than you can find today, but to manage all that. But it'll be a very exciting time for you. So really appreciate this, and I also want to commend Judith's comments about smart thermostats and the like, or maybe things we can do in a way now that can help customers start modifying their behavior on that. Any other comments? Lisa, did you were about to touch?
Well, I'm sitting here and pondering stress tests some more, and 20% load growth. I'm just speculating. I just want to be sure that the whole point of stress tests is to be really extreme. And if we talk a lot here about what if electric vehicle adoption goes through the roof, and what if people install level 2 or super powerful chargers, and what if everybody charges their car at the same time? Like, does that net out at 20% load growth? Or does that net out at some crazy spike in power consumption at a moment in time? I don't know. I just want to put the question out there that my hope for the stress tests would be that they consider some pretty extreme scenarios. And on the financial side, a complete, an economic bubble bursting and people's behavior changing dramatically. Such as, for example, if they'd signed up for an above-market solar program and then they were no longer interested, and who bears the financial risk of that happening? Yeah.
So on that score, I think there are, so what we are talking mainly here about DER, but outside DER, I think what you're talking about is very true. And whether a new server farm can come into town, that can easily take up 5% of the entire city's load. Or there can be direct access, where some customers, state law passes and there is ability for customers to leave our system. We don't think they will leave given our lower rates, but that can reduce the supply portion of our system. Or loads dropping and us having to sell some of our supply in the market at a price higher than what we paid for. So those are kind of not DER-related stress tests. They are kind of more of a strategic utility-wide stress test, which will be part of the strategic plan. And this was more of a distribution system-level stress test. So a little bit more contained is what we're thinking about. But that one will be part of the strategic planning stress testing.
But electric vehicles are on the list of DERs. Mm-hmm. And I was talking about, I hate to bring it up again, community solar, which is also on DER. So I was trying to stay on topic.
I spent last week, like 5 days, listening to people, like utilities complain and be worried about that they were going to have, that their load growth, their loads are not growing, but rather declining, and what to do about it. So the idea of most utilities would love to have the problem of load growth. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is that because we are this epicenter of EV adoption, we have this amazing opportunity to really show how it can work in a very viable way. And that's one of the things why I'm so enthusiastic about it, because what we can show with electrification of transportation, and not just individual vehicles, but also city vehicles and things like that, we can really show a model for how it can work in a way that is really substantive and can really have a bearing on U.S. society in a way that's enormous. And I just think we're, I don't think it actually grows quite that fast, that there wouldn't be time to get transformers in or things like that. And you could even do a voluntary program if you were really worried, to ask people to let the city know when they were getting an EV so they could be prepared. And, there are things you could do that I think would be manageable about that. But I think that the desire that you're talking about of people wanting community solar, whether it makes total economic sense or not, I think that's one of the things that we're seeing, is that there are these very popular ideas that capture people's imagination, and it isn't necessarily, the economics of it isn't necessarily always what they're worried about. And so I just think it's, and that's where having AMI lets you really tweak it, and it works to your point about drought as well, that the innovations that can happen in terms of water management and leak detection and that sort of thing can also happen if we have that kind of infrastructure that leverages our fiber ring and all the other investments that the city's made.
One comment, I like you list everything, including energy efficiency, and I don't know if the department has it, but it'd be good at some point to formulate and update something like that old McKinsey study from 10 years ago that showed here's the sources of energy and what they cost per carbon reduction, and showed energy efficiency as being the most efficient. But just the menu of items that the department considers, so that when we look at programs or ideas, we can see the dollar better spent here or there or whatever. It's just a really good tool to have. And
we developed one of those about a couple of years ago as part of our electrification effort, PV versus heat pump water heaters versus, so we can
I remember that part of the presentation, but it goes
to solar.
Would we do better to subsidize thermostats, for example, for smart thermostats or something, or subsidize sensors for HVAC systems in commercial buildings or whatever? Good to see you. I see a lot of nodding. I'll leave it at that. Any other discussion on this point?
I'll just say that I think a lot of that analysis, it maybe happens behind the scenes when we were delivering on our mandate to purchase all cost-effective energy efficiency. That's an existing practice, well established in the utility industry and summarized in our demand-side management report. And maybe we can expose a little bit more of that.
I think it'd be great to expose more, and how you make trade-offs between that and buying more solar, for example, or whatever.
Yep.
Is that enough discussion on this, Commission? Thank you, Shiva. It was a very excellent discussion.
Thank you.
Our next agenda item is approve policy objectives for the wastewater collection utility cost. And this one isn't so hard. Do you guys want to address this?
I'd like to introduce Senior Resource Planner and Rates Manager Eric Keniston, who will talk a little bit about this.
Oh, Eric.
Good evening, Commissioners. So this is a fairly straightforward, it's time for us to sit down and do another wastewater cost of service study for our collection system. Last time we prepared one was in 2011, so it's been several years and time we'd like to update. And in the past, UAC and Council have both expressed an interest in having some input in this before we start working on it and getting the whole study going. Some just basic policy objectives that we have. All, the rates for in-cost service study must be based on the cost to serve customers. That's mandated. We have to do that. We shall do that at all times. But one of the things that customers have expressed interest in, that we've heard from others since we did the last cost of service study, was seeing if there was a way for, say, smaller residential units to see if we could do a differentiated rate. Currently, all residential customers have a single flat monthly rate, and some have said, is it possible to have a different or lesser rate for, like, say, apartment dwellers? The other objective that we would look at is to see if there are any proposed rate designs could mitigate the impact on low-income customers, if at all possible. So those are the three basic policy objectives that we came up with internally, and we're here to seek any feedback that you may have, any ideas, comments, concerns. We'll take this next to Finance and Council to see if they have any ideas or issues. And ideally, our objective is to try and have this COSA done this fiscal year for presentation when we do the rate proposal in FY19.
Any comments or questions on the proposal?
I thought this all made good sense to me, and particularly the objectives that you laid out.
Macy? Or Terry?
Yeah, Eric, I'm a little confused, maybe a whole lot confused. So how do we have the costs tied to the usage by the customer and have flat rates?
So for residential customers, it's not based on their individual usage. It's based on class average usages. In most cases, we don't have, in single-family residential homes, for instance, you could have a tie, but not in all cases are the wastewater charges at the same facility or at the same unit as where the water charges are, especially when it comes to apartments and multifamily homes. So we've made actually better strides in getting better linkage to get that water usage relative to units. But the next phase would be to go to something like, say, some agencies do base their wastewater charges based on winter water usage, same that we do for commercial customers here. That's something we could evaluate. But there are, again, system dynamics that are come into play. Our current billing system is, we're getting ready to undergo renovation. That would be something that we would look at in the next iteration, but maybe not something that we would conceive of doing at this juncture. But it is something that we could have the study look into if that is a concern.
So you have a class average for residentials, and one of your objectives is whether we have a couple of class averages for different types of residentials.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Is there, if you had to hazard a guess, would, if you have a giant house on University Avenue, that, with 10 bathrooms and, it's like a giant whatever, compared to somebody's bungalow, is the delta going to be enormous if you were to do it based on sort of the allocation of the fixed costs and overhead kind of thing as part of it, as opposed to, would it be a huge difference?
Well, that's what we'd have to look at. We'd look at basically the lowest, the averaging method you use would be to take the lowest month's usage and say that, or like the wettest months, and say generally irrigation is not a factor, and use those as your basis for determining what their usage is. We might find with some households that we might have a larger customer class that we get even higher usage. We'll have that evaluated as part of the study as well.
Yeah, because I just think just in general, and the whole idea of when the whole concept of demand charges and how I'm a big proponent of, instead of doing it as like for electricity, the highest one-day peak, or in the case of water, the highest one-day usage, but rather, we have a building of a certain size, we expect to have this kind of level of service, is the allocation would be smaller for a small house than for something that's really enormous. And so I guess just from a philosophical standpoint, if that can factor into how you look at it, I understand what you're saying about the CIS, that maybe now is not the time, if we're talking $34, now is not the time to make a big deal about it. So.
And it may correlate more with number of residents than the size of the house. Yeah. All right, any further discussion?
That's a good question. Usually, maybe this is what you're going to investigate with the COSA, right? But usually when you think about sort of difference in water consumption between single-family houses and multi-units, usually you're thinking of, basically landscaping and irrigation is sort of the major difference, right? Because the rest of it's cooking, toilets, showers, and sort of the stuff that, Michael said, tracks number of residents as opposed, right? But in wastewater, does irrigation and landscaping contribute to wastewater?
And it's usually factored out when we try and take that out. We might find that there isn't that much difference between the two, but again, if you do have single-family homes with a lot larger footprint versus apartments with a much smaller footprint and say only one toilet and maybe in general fewer, we don't have the data necessarily on number of occupants, but if you can get usage dynamics, water flow for one set of customers versus the other, and you do see differences, then maybe you can make some estimations for different charge.
Yeah, I would have guessed that footprint wasn't the major determinant, but like number of people, right? But anyway, I think maybe that's what you're going to find out. Okay.
I'd just toss in that you could get some very clear indications by just looking at census data that multifamily residences have fewer people in them than single family and on average, and that's one reason that you tend to see lower indoor consumption.
There's no more discussion. This is an action item. I heard general support. Is there a motion to approve the staff's recommendation?
Second. Aye.
Aye.
That passes.
Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
All right. 15 minutes behind still. Discussion on the electric integrated resource plan.
I would like to introduce Senior Resource Planner Monica Padilla as the lead for a substantial team that's working on the electric integrated resource plan.
I need to load it.
Oh, here. Should be that one right there.
Okay. Good evening, Commissioners. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge some of my colleagues that are here that have helped me thus far in this process of developing an electric integrated resource plan. We've got quite an extensive team, but here tonight are Shiva Swaminathan, who is an incredible resource, especially as it relates to distributed energy resources and everything related to the Cal ISO market. Jonathan, who also helps me extensively, and who is not here, Jim Stack, who is also Senior Resource Planner and works extensively on renewable portfolio standard. In addition to my colleagues here at the city, I have some colleagues to thank at the Northern California Power Agency, namely Dave Dockham and Tony Zimmer, who helped me with this presentation tonight, but were not able to be here to help deliver it. So I will do my best to try to do it. With that, I want to say thanks for giving me this opportunity to, again, come to you and essentially continue our discussion or education, I guess, process about the things that we think about when we develop an electric integrated resource plan. And so the last time we were here talking to you about our new IRP, which will cover the 2019 to 2030 planning horizon, We talked a little bit, or maybe quite extensively, about the city's history of planning and developing long-term procurement and energy management plans, including the most recent one that our city council adopted in 2012, which we referred to as the Long-Term Electric Acquisition Plan, or LEAP. We also provided a real high-level overview of the makeup of our existing supply portfolio and our load projections, and identified some potential gaps in our load and resource balances in the future, namely in 2024, when our existing contract with the Western Area Power Administration is set to expire, and the big deficit that potentially could present in our portfolio, and what we would do about that. We also talked a little bit about some of the key drivers, aside from the Western Base Resource contract expiring, but those around how much renewable portfolio standards we want in our portfolio, and how to best achieve carbon neutrality for the city of Palo Alto. And then last, we asked for your feedback on our our work plan to develop this integrated resource plan, with the goal of getting to council no later than January 2019, a plan that they could adopt and that we could then submit to the California Energy Commission to meet our compliance requirements for providing a integrated resource plan by April of 2019. Here's just a summary of that work plan itself. Just wanted to let you know that while we hope to stick to this as much as possible, things have changed, and as we're going through this process, we've modified it to be hopefully a better process for not just the Utility Advisory Commission, but for staff and for council when they ultimately consider this. One of the things that I wanted to highlight that is not, the details aren't here, but they're later in the work plan that is provided as an attachment to your memo and in the back of this presentation, is this concept of what does this all mean, all of these discussions that we're having and talking about the resources. Well, ultimately, it's to answer that question, what is our supply makeup going to be essentially for the next 10, 11 years or beyond? And in going through that process, we'll look at distributed energy resources, we'll look at our large hydro mix, we'll look at our RPS, or renewable portfolio standard, and then define, again, how to meet carbon neutrality. And to get there, we will propose a list of alternative portfolios with different mixes of those different resources, large hydro versus DER versus carbon neutral resources, and evaluate those portfolios based on different metrics and stress test them to different scenarios. So that study, while we had always planned to do it, wasn't really called out in the work plan, but that'll begin as early as September when we come back to you with those portfolio alternatives and get your feedback then. So I just wanted to highlight that that is our intent, and ultimately based on that analysis and the feedback we get from the UAC and then from council, that will form our strategies that are incorporated within our integrated resource plan. Okay, again, some of the key policy questions that we identified last time. The main policies, one more time, is large hydro versus renewable portfolio standard, and how to best achieve our carbon neutrality goals. So for tonight, the focus of tonight's presentation is really, again, to provide some context so that when we come to you and we talk to you about alternatives and strategies and objectives, you're coming to the questions with maybe some of the same information, or at least context or background that we have and that we think is useful in making those decisions. So for starters, we'll talk about, at a real high level, provide an overview of the California wholesale energy market or electricity market, and then what Palo Alto's role, how we interact with the California wholesale market. Again, at a really high level, that's not my area of expertise, but hopefully I can do it some justice. And then also, here in Palo Alto, what are the main cost drivers that our electric supply portfolio is faced with, not just in the near term like this year or next year, but for the next 10, 11, 20 years, actually just through 2030 is what I think I provided tonight. And then lastly, some of the big uncertainties and risks that the portfolio faces and how we currently manage those risks and will probably manage them in the future as well. So at a very simple level, the market is made up of supply and demand. But what makes it complicated is that supply must match demand at all times. And to achieve this, at least in California, we created I would think, a relatively complicated market to do so. That market structure is made up of several market players, rules, regulations, standards, tariffs, governing bodies, regulatory bodies, compliance agencies, laws, products, and a whole bunch of other ways. So while it's just supply and demand, there's a lot of activity that goes around having supply and demand match. In Palo Alto, in California, the CalISO, or the California Independent System Operator, is king. They are the largest balancing authority in California, and that is the one that Palo Alto participates in. The ISO is the grid operator charged with ensuring not just reliability, but that load and resources are balanced in the most cost-effective manner. So it's not just keeping the lights on, it's keeping the lights on at the cheapest price. That is their charge. Palo Alto's interaction with the CalISO is through the Northern California Power Agency. So we are a member of NCPA. We've been a member since we're a founding member since 1968. We believe NCPA to be essentially an extension of our staff. So in Palo Alto, the group that's charged with managing the electric supply portfolio does so more on a long-term basis all the way till when the month starts. When the delivery month starts, we then hand over our portfolio to NCPA, and they become the managers of that portfolio. So they're charged with making sure, essentially, that our policies and our objectives are carried out into real time. As such, they're our primary scheduling coordinator. They're responsible for scheduling all of our load into the ISO, and for the most part, all of our resources, with the exception of a couple of wind contracts. They schedule all of our supply resources into the ISO. And they do this essentially at, I don't want to say without any effort, but they do it very well for us. And so that is why we're able to maintain our lights on and, for the most part, keep our rates low. So in these pictures here, you can see there's three things I want to highlight. One is the wind projects that we are off-taker of in the in the Solano County area. The second picture is a picture of NCPA's dispatch center. And then the last is a picture of the CalISO. So within NCPA, NCPA operates or manages what's called a metered subsystem agreement. And that metered subsystem agreement essentially acts as a mini sub-control area within the CalISO. So even though we interact with the CalISO, we interact at a very different level than, say, PG&E does, or say, a direct access participant does. We have a special arrangement in place with the ISO that allows us to follow our load and, for the most part, our resources on our own. So we don't rely on the CalISO on a day-ahead basis to balance those needs. We're able to use our own generation, most notably Calaveras, our hydroelectric resource plant over in Calaveras County, to follow our load up and down in real time. And this arrangement provides some tremendous benefits for Palo Alto and for the other NCPA members who participate in the Metered Subsystem Agreement program through the ISO. So we're kind of unique in that way from any other entity in California. And so with that comes some responsibility as well, and some advantages. This picture here kind of shows you some of the resources and members that NCPA currently serves and some of the generation that they schedule into the ISO. So you probably don't know what any of that means. It's the combined turbine, and those are located in Alameda, a hydro resource, a Lodi Energy Center, which is located in Lodi, and a geothermal plant. And then the loads of all those members is what they schedule in. So on any given day, the CalISO will be managing requests from over 760 power plants that will want to generate onto 26,000 circuit miles making up the CalISO grid. NCPA is one of 140 scheduling coordinators interacting with the CalISO on a daily basis. And as such, they are responsible for communicating 11 member loads, 5 NCPA-owned generators, 13 member-owned generators, and more than 20 power supply contracts, of which 12 of them belong to Palo Alto alone. So we provide a huge amount of work to NCPA relative to the other members. This kind of illustrates how the interaction between NCPA and the CalISO works. A pre-scheduling is what happens on a day-ahead basis, and so there NCPA will look at all the members' loads, including Palo Alto's and all the members' generation and contracts, and will come up with a schedule for the next day. They then send that schedule to their scheduling coordination or their dispatch center, who then communicates that to the ISO, and then the ISO sends back in exchange a response about how they want load and resources to be scheduled the next day through the use of price signals. Ultimately, NCPA is also responsible for the dispatch of all of those generations in real time, and again, following those resources and load in real time. And then after the fact, they also do all the settlement for Palo Alto with the CalISO.
You said we're unique in that we follow the load. The other cities don't do it that way. Could you explain that again?
Right, so under the metered subsystem agreement, the CalISO recognizes us as one aggregated load. So when we combine with, say, Alameda and Barrier Rapid BART and the Port of Oakland and Biggs and Greeley, all these cities that belong to NCPA, the ISO recognizes us as one aggregated load. And they also recognize all our generation as one aggregated source of generation. And so to the extent that we forecast the next day that we're going to be, say, at a certain megawatts of capacity in 1 hour, and we get into the day and we don't achieve that, we're able to use our own generation sources to go up and down to follow that load. Absent an MSSA, the CalISO would be the one who balances us in real time, and then they would charge us for that. So we have a very unique arrangement in that way. So, and we're allowed to have that arrangement because the ISO, when it formed, it recognized this unique joint power agency that existed with NCPA and the resources that they had to be able to do this, including the staffing and the IT system and everything else. So we were unique in that way when the ISO formed. So one of the things that you may hear quite a bit of, at least have heard of recently, is this idea of overgeneration. And overgeneration because mostly this huge concentrations or acceleration of solar in California because of renewable power portfolio standard. And overgeneration is a real problem. It really does exist, and it exists more so in the months of the spring where the load just doesn't materialize like it needs to, like in the summer months when it gets hot and you have a lot of sun. In addition to sun, it also happens to be the months where you get more wind as well because for some reason wind blows more in the spring. And then you also get a lot of hydro generation because of uncontrolled runoffs happen in the spring as well. So those are all things that contribute to overgeneration. But the CalISO on a day-ahead basis has the tools and resources available to them to help them manage this overgeneration. And on a day-ahead basis, they'll send out price signals when they think this is going to happen. Those price signals are usually in the form of a negative price, where they say, if you generate, we will charge you. We won't pay you to generate, but we're going to charge you to generate. So when we receive, we being NCPA, receives those price signals, we have in place with NCPA and our suppliers the ability to curtail for economic reasons. So they let us back down our generation. They'll turn off the inverters on the solar system. We'll back down our hydro resources, and to the extent that we can back down wind, we'll back that down as well. So we avoid this issue of penalties because of curtailment. So on a day-ahead basis, there's things in place that allow us to manage that pretty well. In real time, it still happens, though, and it happens usually because load doesn't materialize, and the sun still shines, and they weren't able to shut off the inverters quick enough, or something happens. But you do get situations where you have curtailments. And when those curtailments happen, before they can happen, the ISO does its very, very best job of trying to avoid it, because the last thing they want to do is to shut down solar. Before they'll shut down solar, they'll export it out. And so the ISO has put together this market called the Energy Imbalance Market, which allows them to use other balancing authorities that are adjacent to the CalISO to essentially move electricity back and forth, so that if, say, a balancing authority has a need for more generation, they'll pick up our generation, or we'll pick up their generation. So before any curtailment happens, the ISO will try to do that first. They'll employ the energy imbalance market to avoid curtailments, but they still happen. But they don't happen as often as we think they happen, but they do happen.
How broad is that? I mean, how far does that market extend? Does it extend to Mississippi?
Yes. So this graph here, I don't know if you could see that. So this shows right now all the active participants in the energy imbalance market. So right now, Pacificor, Nevada Energy, Puget Sound, and Arizona Public Service are current participants in EIM. There are also other balancing authorities that have their application in and have been approved by the EIM governing board, and they will come on as the illustration shows up there between 2017 and 2019. One of the most notable ones that is just a recent thing is LADWP is joining the balancing authority, so or the EIM. The energy imbalance market itself has the ability to save California ratepayers billions of dollars, and the ability to move energy back and forth. It's just, if somebody else has a need for it, we'll move it over. Some of the issues with the energy imbalance market, however, is that it only works in the 5-minute market, so it's only a real-time market. You can't use it for day-ahead balancing, so that if they're on a day-ahead basis, if you see a potential issue, you can't really move the electricity because it's just a 5-minute market. But to combat that, the ISO is looking at expanding its footprint through what is called regionalization. And this is something that Governor Brown directed the state to look at as part of SB 350, this expansion of the ISO. And the thought there is that by expanding, there'd be even greater savings and opportunities to bring in, say, wind power from Wyoming, or send some of our dirtier resources to Wyoming, something like that. Problem with expansion of the ISO is that it's not very popular outside of California. Nobody wants to be governed by Governor Brown outside of California, apparently. And so there's major governance issues associated with how this expanded ISO will work. And that's been one of the main kind of issues that has held it up. Palo Alto and other NCPA members, we generally support the expansion, just like we generally support EIM, because it just creates a more efficient market overall. But we also have concerns, and our biggest concerns have to do with transmission costs. That if the ISO expands to Wyoming, say, which Wyoming really wants to get Wyoming wind to California, who's going to pay to bring it here? Well, the people of Wyoming believe that California should pay for it, so California should pay for the build-out of transmission between Wyoming and California. Obviously, Californians don't want to pay for more transmission, and so that's the big debate right now is, if it happens, who's going to pay for the transmission? Or how are those transmission charges going to be allocated to Californians versus non-Californians?
Does that, I mean, given that some of those areas are in different time zones, does that assist us, does that help with sort of the peaks and valleys and the duck curve and so forth?
I would imagine so, yeah. Yeah, I'm not an expert on time zone differences and how other states' loads behave relative to California's load, but certainly I think that the more diversity you get in regions, times, resources, and everything else creates a more efficient market.
So what do you think the impact's going to be when Diablo Canyon shuts down, and we're going to lose that source of carbon, of no carbon generation, and we're going to be picking up all kinds of coal and plants that are coming from those new areas?
Well, I believe that the policies that are in place at the state level right now would prevent that from happening. So, PG&E is retiring Diablo Canyon for reasons other than basically because they don't need it anymore. Their load is leaving. PG&E's load is leaving. It's leaving to
Yeah, but it's for economics. I mean, it's not.
well, that and the cost of relicensing Diablo are just prohibitive. It's like $50 billion to relicense Diablo. So that they don't have the load to support it. There's an RPS mandate that doesn't allow it, and the cost of it is just exorbitant. So they're doing it because it doesn't make sense to run that anymore. And all projections that we see right now at the state level for being able to meet, say, a 60% RPS in 2030 and perhaps a clean energy portfolio by the year 2045, show no need for Diablo or a whole lot of other fossil fuel-based resources in California.
Well, I mean, I don't know why you're lumping it in with fossil fuel-based resources, but
Right, it is a carbon
because we're going to be getting a lot of coal then from, when we're getting the energy from Idaho and Montana, whatever there will be some wind, but we're going to be getting some real dirty stuff that we haven't been getting.
Right, and that's one of the other issues that has kind of held up the whole ISO expansion is how to prevent coal from New Mexico coming into California and solar from California going into New Mexico. And to address that, I think one of the things that is out there is the idea of putting carbon taxes or imports to make it so that it's not as cost effective to import coal from New Mexico. And the state is very much moving in a direction where there's not going to be any more nuclear in California, and it'll still be a low carbon portfolio. And they hope to achieve this through utility scale solar, energy storage, hydro, and all the other renewables. Yeah.
We can debate that another time if that's really realistic, but okay.
That is Governor Brown's policy, though, yeah. Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm going to go on to the second part unless there's any questions associated with this one. So the second part is more related to what we do here in Palo Alto. And just going to briefly talk about our fiscal year 2018 electric supply costs and long-term forecast of costs, key cost drivers, and uncertainties we face in the future. So Council approved a budget for fiscal year 2018, which included for the electric supply business unit a $158 million revenue requirement. Of that $158 million, $88 million of it is attributed to the electric supply portfolio. So the area in blue for fiscal year 2018 is this area here. And so that's the part that I'll focus on. This here represents not what was approved at budget time, but our current assessment of what fiscal year 2018 electric supply costs are going to be. So when council adopted the budget, those electric supply costs were close to $88 million. Now, given the changes to our hydroelectric resources, given the very kind of wet year we had this last year, our supply costs are projected to be closer to $80 million. So they've already come down quite a bit. And that's mainly, again, because hydro came on. We're avoiding making some market purchases that we thought we were going to make at budget time. And in addition to that, we have some surplus resources that we will be selling into the market on a day-ahead basis and receiving revenues from the sale of those resources. So for Palo Alto, the key cost components in fiscal year 2018 include an RPS of about $38.6 million. So that's the cost of achieving a 60% RPS with solar, wind, and landfill gas projects that have been in place. So that's roughly 50% of our supply cost for 2018. Western-based resource, which is our single biggest source of electricity. It meets, in this year, 40% of our load, but a couple of years ago, it was closer to like 28%, so it's very variable. Western-based resource accounts for about $12.5 million, and that essentially includes two main components: the costs related to the project for generating out of the Central Valley project, and then the restoration fees related to the Central Valley Project Improvement Act, which requires power and water customers from the project to pay to restore the habitat of that watershed. So it's an environmental fund, essentially. And then last, transmission costs. So these are costs associated with transmitting with power from wherever it's located to Palo Alto. In 2018, our transmission costs are estimated to be $17.5 million. And so that's on a per megawatt hour basis. When you look at the high voltage and the low voltage rates that go into the transmission charges, it's about $22 a megawatt hour. So $22 a megawatt hour, to put it in perspective, right now you can buy electricity, just the energy, generic energy, at about $36 to $40 a megawatt hour. So it costs us $22 a megawatt hour to transmit what's essentially a $40 product. So there's a huge amount of costs go into transmission, and that's why we care so much about the expansion of the ISO and what that might do to transmission costs in the future. Because those aren't things that we can easily manage. We can do more distributed generation or local solar in Palo Alto and avoid some of those costs, or we could do more energy efficiency, avoid some of those costs, but we're not able to avoid a lot of that cost. This just shows the projected costs through 2030. The big change there that you may or may not be able to tell from this graph is associated with Western. So Western costs are expected to get as high as $18 million by the year 2030. And so again, our contract expires at the end of 2024. And these cost projections are purely based on what we know today, based on cost allocations today that Western has assigned to us, or the Bureau of Reclamation has assigned to Western to assign to us. Those costs are subject to change, and they will change, and we don't believe they're going to go down. So we think that this estimate of $18 million is probably pretty conservative, and that it'll be much more than $18 million in the future for that portion, for that resource itself.
So the cost for Western look like it's going up at a fairly steady rate. Is that just inflation, or?
No, that's Western's projection of what they need to run the project for capital improvement, for transmission costs. It's Western's forecast of their costs, but it's in the absence of an updated cost allocation study. The last time they did the cost allocation study for this resource was back in 1970-something, 72 or something, and so, but they have a deadline to get it done by the end of this year, so maybe, we'll see. In addition to that, our RPS looks like it's pretty steady. You see kind of a decline in 2030, but that's only because some of our contracts have come offline, and we'll most likely replace those contracts because the state is moving towards a higher RPS. They're looking at implementing, I believe it's 60% by 2030. That's under a new bill that's in the works right now, SB 100. So we'll most likely be shopping for additional renewables to meet this new RPS. And in September, we'll talk a lot about the RPS and some of the issues around that and some of the modifications that we have to make and some of the modifications that we may want to make to improve that portfolio standard.
Monica, where does the debt service come from?
So we have on this graph, all we're showing here is debt service related to Calaveras. And you will notice that debt service actually goes down in 2025. We pay off a lot of the debt associated with Calaveras. So Calaveras was built in the 80s. I think we had a 30-year bond.
I think multiple refinanced.
Yeah, and we refinanced many times.
Longer than that.
Yeah, but the debt on Calaveras, which is our hydroelectric facility, all of it's paid off by 2033, and that's when the license for Calaveras also expires. But a big chunk of it goes away in 2025. We also have debt associated with our transmission project, our California-Oregon transmission project, but we're operating under a layoff right now, and our recipients of our layoff pay our debt for us, so it's not reflected here. So when we look at our supply costs, we don't put a whole lot of stock in them for any more than a year out, for that matter, because they're so there's so many things, so many variables that impact our costs. And some of these are recurring changes, that things that we can predict that will change. We don't know how much they'll change, but we know they will change. And those are related to hydroelectricity. Obviously, both projects are highly dependent on precipitation levels, and so those change every year. Market prices, to the extent that we're deficit, we have to buy on the market, and to the extent that we're surplus, we have to sell on the market. And so the portfolio costs change with market prices. And then this last one, intermittent resources. With such a concentration of solar now in our portfolio, we're starting to see some new recurring costs associated with what's called congestion, and that's when it costs more to move those solar resources because of transmission or the constraints. And so we're starting to see that, we're modeling it, we're trying to figure out how to manage it better in the future. But this is kind of new to our portfolio. In the future, we see some large uncertainties, and those large uncertainties, some of them we can manage easily, or not easily, but some of them we have things in place to manage. Others we're still trying to figure out, and working with other cities, working with NCPA, working with the California Municipal Utility Association and the American Public Power Association to manage some of these things that are common across with all public power, and we all have the same kind of objective in mind. But those large uncertainties are centered around transmission costs, so the TAC charges, resource adequacy, our Western-based resource contract, RPS, and again, regionalization of the ISO. And then last, there's this uncertainty related to net revenue, and that materializes when load goes up and down. And we account for that for some extent on an annual basis. We know that we're not going to ever predict how much load we'll actually get and how much revenue we'll get. But long-term, load variability associated with distributed generation, distributed energy resources, electric vehicles, and perhaps even load departure, maybe if direct access happens and customers leave us, those all have impacts on our ability to meet our revenue requirements. This is just an illustration of how hard it is to manage the supply, that is the supply variability in our portfolio associated with hydro. So you can see here in an average year, the typical norm, the new norm for Palo Alto, given our RPS and our carbon neutral portfolio, is to be about 6% surplus on an average year. That's if that's based on a 50 percentile precip condition. But in a wet year, we can be as surplus as 35%. And so we have the tools and the contracts and the ability to manage that surplus position. We can easily sell those into, go ahead.
This is because of the nonsense that hydro is not considered a renewable resource, is that right?
No, this is just because we have our contract with Western requires that we take 12.3% of whatever gets generated.
Okay, I'm confusing issues.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, it's what's called a run-of-a-river type resource. And so in wet years, we get a lot. In dry years, we don't get so much. Okay. So you could see that this is what we manage on an annual basis, or could manage on an annual basis. This illustration just shows what the impacts of hydro and market prices could do to rates in the future. It's purely for illustrative purposes. There's no probabilities associated with any of this. It's just if prices went to this level and hydro went to that level, this is what rates could be. And here you can kind of see from a budget standpoint how difficult it is to budget for the electric supply portfolio given all the uncertainty. For fiscal year 2016, for instance, we budgeted back in at the end of 2014, because that's when we have to start coming up with their supply projection or cost projections. So when council adopted the budget, they expected supply costs to be about $75 million for fiscal year 2016. But supply costs actually ended up being $80 million. And so that $5 million difference was mostly the result of a dry hydro year, which forced us onto the market to buy additional resources. Conversely, in fiscal year 2017, we budgeted $83 million, given what we thought hydro was going to do and we thought market prices were going to do. But then hydro materialized, and then we ended up at $80.5 million. So these are some of the challenges we face, and we manage these challenges through the use of reserves for the most part, because these are just recurring costs, and they're just cash flow issues, and we carry reserves on hand to manage the fluctuations up and down. So in addition to using reserves, our city council has adopted since, I think, 2001, I think it's been in place, an energy risk management program. And that energy risk management program consists of 3 components. A council-adopted set of policies that tell us what we can and cannot do as it relates to procurement in the near term for the electric supply portfolio, a set of guidelines that are under the purview of the city manager's office, and then procedures for exactly how we go about procuring and managing our portfolio on a month ahead, a year ahead, up to 3 years. So this program has been in place since 2001, and for the most part has kept us out of some serious trouble. And I'll just leave it there. In addition to that, we also we had a very aggressive hedging strategy in place, which we called a 3-year laddering strategy when we had these huge deficits. With our RPS being 60% and so much hydro resources, we're not really having to buy on a forward basis very much energy anymore for hedging purposes. In fact, when we do buy, it's usually accompanied with a sell as well, since we have so much surplus position in certain months. So we buy and sell at the same time, and that way we avoid buying in a high market and selling in a low market when we do it at the same time. We also work extensively with NCPA on scheduling optimization and bidding strategies to manage some of those real-time and day-ahead risk issues. And then through our legislative and regulatory advocacy program, there should have been a space in between, a line in between those two. We work towards trying to ensure that fair and just and reasonable rules and regulations and laws get put in place. And that's through, we have an L&R program here in the city, and we work with NCPA, and we work with CMUA and APPA on that. And then again, just the use of reserves and again, working with other agencies to leverage our common interests. So last, I just wanted to throw up here the work plan once again and highlight what you'll see next month. So next month's going to be a really exciting month. We have 2 main topics for you. The first one is all around hydroelectric resources. So everything you want to know, and then some about our hydro resources in our portfolio, so Calaveras and Western-based resource, including providing you an overview of what the Western's 2025 power marketing plan entails and requires right now of us. We will also be presenting a recommendation on how to manage hydro risk in our portfolio. This is something that we've been working on for some time now, and I think it just so happens that it's coming about the same time to the UAC, and it fits very well with the discussion related to hydro. And then last, what I mentioned earlier is this introduction of these different portfolios that we will examine as part of this process and get your feedback on those portfolios and maybe what else you guys might want to see and some of the metrics we'll use to evaluate one portfolio against another portfolio. So with that, that's all I have for tonight.
Appreciate that, Monica. Any questions for Ms. Padilla before we? Okay, all right.
I will mention I had several as we went, and you always managed to answer them in the next slide or two, so much appreciated.
All right. Well, then thanks again. We'll get on to our last agenda item, which is the selection of topics for future meetings. Ed, earlier on, you had suggested that maybe the October meeting be used for the workshop for the strategic plan and invite people in topics. Now, as you look at what's on the agenda already for October, is it difficult for staff if we move those around to other months, or?
I think we've been talking about it, so we could make that work. There is... I think there's some flexibility that we have to move the other things around if that were the interest of the commission.
We don't need a decision today, but
having some sense of whether that date presents any conflicts for you would be helpful. And again, this is the 4th of October.
I just couldn't check my calendar to know. I just don't want it to be on Yom Kippur, which I know is around that time. So I just couldn't. I don't have an internet connection to check.
Actually, I mentioned I'm working with a group of utilities in Europe. I may have to be overseas then for that day.
So again, perhaps we'll take it under advisement, and we'll talk to the consultant to see if they can make it, and either could do a doodle poll, as had been suggested previously, or we'll get back to you to let you know what flexibility we might have.
Okay, yeah, doodle poll might not be a bad idea. And I think when we do the workshop, maybe a little less than random staff presentations, but perhaps if you've got others, either from the community, others who've been identified, who want to give a short presentation so that it's thoughtfully done, it would be great.
Well, it's an interesting thought. I think the way we had been approaching it would be that by that point in time, we'll have some additional information, at least preliminary direction, and some areas of priority for the utility, and that this would be an opportunity to get some feedback from community on those without having locked in at that point in time, which would then lead to further UAC discussion. So that was kind of the format that we had in mind. As opposed to, I'm sorry.
I was just going to ask, would it take place in this room? Would it be like the people who wanted to participate would be filing comment cards? A month ago, we talked about the SCAP workshop that happened in the Jordan Middle School cafeteria and was much more of a free-flowing,
Engaging.
Small group.
Right.
Like, what are you guys picturing for this, just out of curiosity?
Much more the latter of much more interactive, not a Brown Act per se meeting, so that it could be much more informal. So that was what we had in mind. Okay, so we'll look at the dates and see what might work there. I also don't have the ability to double check on Yom Kippur. We're okay? Oh, well, good. Well, perhaps we'll settle in on that date then.
Commissioners, any other topics you want to see or ask about on this? Yes, Ed.
Actually, I do have one that didn't make it on the list. That's a follow-up on our last discussion, which is the next steps on cross-port program. We had talked about the audit. The formal next step related to the audit is that will go to the City Council for approval, and I see it's actually proposed to be on their agenda for the 14th. And it's on consent, so it wouldn't be discussed if it stays in that current format. That said, we think we can come back to the Commission in September. Hopefully, if not, we may need to default back to October, but hopefully we'll keep it on September if we do the utility strategic planning instead in October. In order to bring back next steps and perhaps a broader discussion of cross-ports, not limited to the audit. The audit became a bit of a myopic exercise, and we could take a step back and focus on what we're trying to achieve with the program and both the next steps, priorities, and timeframe for those.
We had talked about at some point, I thought we'd had it on the calendar, but I don't see it. Some presentation on the low-income segment of the Palo Alto community and what programs are available in the
market segmentation, yes, and in fact, staff has been talking about that. I don't think had come up with a specific both time frame and frame to bring that back. But Jonathan, you want to comment on that?
We're reviewing data. I mean, this is a kind of thing that we should be able to bring you at least some basic data. We're taking a look at what we have and what would be easy to pull together over this week, and trying to balance that against the rest of our priorities, and figuring out a good time to bring that to you.
Okay, well, if we do it at some point this year would be that we ought to be able to fit that in? Yeah.
Timeliness is important because it's relevant to the topics you're discussing right now. So waiting until next year, clearly it wouldn't make sense for us. So we do need to see what we can do in a timely fashion.
One other topic that's been mentioned several times with different words is the whole idea of resiliency, a little bit of technology on a little more deeper dive on how the solar can feed in to keep islanding, you're using that word, or how do we make ourselves more resilient in a broader sense. And you've got a very full calendar these months coming up, but I just wanted to say a technology discussion of that at some point on a night when Commissioner Ballantyne is with us would be really good.
Yes, I think we've talked enough perhaps to have coalesced around that we're dealing with the issue in a number of different pieces, so I think we can bring it together in more of a cohesive discussion for the commission. And again, I think in your discussion with the city council, that I'd expect that will also come through as a clear theme, and one that we'll definitely be able to organize a piece of our strategic planning around as well.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then my last question was mindful of Bob Evans' comments that opened up the meeting. Should we have a short session at some time, just talk about performance of the fiber system and allow time for more citizen comments or whatever? Maybe that's something, Ed, we can talk offline about, whether there'd been any utility in that.
Yeah, I think I'd like to chat with staff a bit about what the specific issues might be, and bring that back to Commission for discussion.
Have you done any looking at any of the predictive analytics applications that have now become available from like companies like Trove that take into account sort of publicly available data and things that isn't data that you have to have collected, but is sort of out there? Is that something that's on your radar?
We're always looking for new tools, but we haven't looked at, if you're able to pass information about those specific tools along, we'd be interested in taking a look. Thanks.
I was just going to echo, whether or not the aside from Bob Evans' specific set of issues and complaints, I would be interested to just understand more about the existing fiber utility. As we've talked about FTTP, we're always really focused on expanding, and I don't have a great understanding of the fiber ring that we have, other than it has 200 some odd customers. But if staff was willing to educate us, I know I would certainly appreciate knowing more. And along the same lines of educating the UAC. We often obviously talk about the customers of the utility, and I think we each have our own experience and people we know. But our visit last month from Tom, am I saying it correctly? Ozen, the Assistant Director of Customer Support.
Yes.
Yeah. Was great, and I was chatting with him in the elevator, and he actually offered to come back and teach us more about customer support and customer service, and I thought that was a great idea, because I think he and his department probably have a lot of just insights and data that could be helpful to us to understand the customer base.
Very good.
Commissioners, any other topics that you considered? Okay. Is there a motion to adjourn?
I'll move to adjourn.
All right, all in favor? Aye. Done. Ed, Jonathan, Dean, everybody, thank you and your team. Great meeting.